107 years old, and his wife, Josie, 86 years old. The couple is receiving a radio as a Christmas gift from the Klan, a gesture that, although seemingly kind, carries a dark irony given the organization's racist and violent history against African Americans. The Klan promoted white supremacy and used such symbolic acts to try to soften its public image while continuing to perpetuate racism and segregation in the United States. In 1863, light-skinned enslaved children in New Orleans were portrayed in a series of photographs that gained significant attention. Although they appeared white, these children were legally considered black due to the one-drop rule, which determined that anyone with any African ancestry, no matter how small, would be classified as a slave. Such photographs were used to raise awareness, highlighting that these children with no visible African features could be seen as part of the community. This helped encourage support for the creation of schools for newly emancipated slaves in New Orleans. Here we see a demonstration of the bell rack, a device used by a slave owner in Alabama to capture runaway slaves. The contraption, fastened around the neck, had a bell at the top of a bar. When the enslaved person tried to escape through foliage or trees, the bell would ring, alerting the owner. The bell rack was also fixed around the waist of the enslaved person by a belt, limiting movement and making escape even more difficult. In this late 19th century photo from Brazil, we see an enslaved woman playing with her master's child. During the slave era, it was common for enslaved women to care for their master's children, performing domestic tasks and creating emotional bonds. For many white children, enslaved women were constant figures, seen as caregivers or nannies. However, these children also grew up in a society that viewed enslaved people as property, resulting in a distorted view of affection and social hierarchy. In this photo, on the left, we see Jesse L. Birch, a bailiff, and Frank M. Rockwell, the local sheriff, on the right, while an African-American woman sits between them. Jesse appears to be pointing his gun at the woman's head, creating a scene of intimidation and violence. This type of image was common to demonstrate the power exercised over African Americans through fear and constant threat. Australian Aboriginals chained in the Wyndham Prison, Western Australia, 1902. Much like enslaved Africans in other parts of the world, Aboriginal people were often treated as inferior and dehumanized, forced to live under brutal conditions and chained like animals. In addition to being deprived of their freedom, Aboriginal people were subjected to policies aimed at civilizing them, causing impacts that still affect Indigenous communities today. An African American being whipped inside a prison in the United States in 1889. Although slavery was officially abolished in 1865, the prison system continued to exploit African Americans through forced labor and physical punishment, especially in the southern states. Prisons were notorious for extremely harsh conditions, and many former slaves were reincorporated into forced labor under accusations of minor offenses. A portrait of Renty, a slave from South Carolina, taken by Louis Agassiz, a Harvard University professor, in 1850. Agassiz used pseudo-scientific racial theories such as polygenism to justify the inferiority of Africans. These theories aimed to prove that human races were distinct based on physical characteristics and were used to defend slavery. Like Agassiz's racist ideas, similar theories about Jews were used in the 20th century by the Nazis to justify persecution, showing the lasting impact of these false beliefs. In this 1860 photograph, we see Andrew Chandler, a member of the 44th Mississippi Infantry, alongside his former slave, Silas Chandler. During the Civil War, Silas accompanied Andrew as a servant, but at a crucial moment, he saved Andrew's life during the Battle of Chickamauga. After the war, as a gesture of gratitude, Andrew gifted Silas a piece of land, where he built a church for his community. Silas continued to live and work in the same region where he had been enslaved, but now with a new position of respect. Jonathan Walker, known as the Man with the Branded Hand, was an American reformer and abolitionist who became a national hero in 1844. He was tried and convicted for attempting to help 7 fugitive slaves escape in search of freedom. Captured during the attempt, Walker was punished with his hand branded with the letters SS, meaning slave stealer, a mark inflicted by the U.S. government. Rather than silencing him, This punishment transformed Walker into a symbol of resistance to slavery and the fight for abolition. In this photograph, taken around 1890 in Zanzibar, we see a young slave boy holding a log over his head as a form of punishment. At that time, Zanzibar was a major center of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean. Enslaved children were often forced to perform extreme physical tasks and were severely punished for minor offenses. Slavery in Zanzibar was officially abolished in 1897, but the impact of this period remained for a long time in the region. A Union soldier posing with his contraband, a young servant who is still a child. Many Union soldiers formed significant bonds with the contraband families, and some even became active advocates for African American rights after the war, contributing to efforts for emancipation and equality. In 1907, in Oman, a British sailor is photographed removing the shackles from the legs of a Swahili slave who had worn them for 3 long years. This moment occurred during a British operation in the Indian Ocean, where the Royal Navy patrolled the area to intercept slave ships and combat the human trade. These patrols had been active for decades, and their mission was to free those who were being held in captivity. Sarah Breedlove, better known as Madame C.J. Walker, driving her new car in 1911. Sarah was the first woman in the United States to become a millionaire by her own means. Born the daughter of former slaves, Walker built an empire of beauty products. At her peak, her fortune was estimated at about $1 million, which today would be equivalent to $30 million. In addition to her business success, she used her wealth to support civil rights causes and help heal the scars left by slavery, promoting education and empowerment in the Black community. Africans captured aboard a slave ship, many in a state of malnutrition, including children. These conditions were common during the transatlantic crossing when Africans were transported in overcrowded and unsanitary ships with little food and water. Malnutrition, disease, and mistreatment resulted in the death of many before they reached the Americas. It is estimated that between 12 and 15 million people were forced to make this journey over more than 3 centuries, with about 2 million dying during the crossing. A man from the county is seen being carried by 2 slaves through the streets of Bahia, Brazil, in 1865. This scene reflects the slave system that still predominated in Brazil, the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888. At the time, it was common for upper-class men to use slave labor for everyday tasks, such as transportation in sedan chairs. Despite growing international pressure for abolition, slavery continued to be the backbone of the economy in many regions of the country. A reward poster offering $150 for the capture of a runaway slave in Bardstown, Kentucky in 1838. These announcements were common in the 19th century, when slaveholders offered rewards for the recapture of those who had fled in search of freedom. These ads usually included detailed descriptions of the runaway slave, mentioning physical characteristics and skills to facilitate their capture. The $150 reward was significant for the time, showing how valuable these slaves were considered. This 1898 photograph, taken in Indiana, shows Lucy Higgs Nichols at the center, a former slave who became the only female member of the Grand Army of the Republic, a Civil War veterans organization. Born enslaved in the South, Lucy escaped to Union lines during the war and worked as a nurse for the 23rd Indiana Infantry Regiment. Years after the conflict, Lucy was recognized as an honorary member of the organization, a remarkable achievement for a woman and former slave during a time of deep racial segregation and discrimination. Samuel Phillips Verner, with Africans he bought to be exhibited at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. Verner brought these individuals to the United States, claiming they were pygmies, in an attempt to exploit public curiosity about African peoples, particularly communities with distinct physical characteristics. The World's Fair was an international showcase and, unfortunately, often featured racist displays that treated Africans as exotic curiosities. An Arab slave trader in custody aboard the HMS Sphinx around 1907. The incident occurred off the coast of Mozambique, where the Royal Navy patrolled the waters to combat the slave trade after the formal abolition of slavery in the British Empire. In operations like this, traffickers were captured and slaves were freed, marking the ongoing effort to dismantle the illegal slave trade in the region. This photograph was taken in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in April 1863 and is one of the most impactful images of the time. In it, we see Gordon, a slave who escaped from a plantation, showing his back full of deep scars, the result of years of whipping. The image became known as the scourged back and was widely used by abolitionists to fight slavery, even being published in Harper's Weekly, further strengthening the fight for freedom during the Civil War. Here we see Rebecca Felton, one day before taking office as the first woman senator of the United States, alongside two politicians from Georgia on November 20, 1922. In addition to being the last former slaveholder to serve in the Senate, Felton advocated for white supremacy and, in public speeches, supported the use of violence to maintain racial control in the South. Felton also believed that slavery was an institution that benefited both whites and blacks, a common view among defenders of the system. The man in this photo was cruelly branded by his owner, who carved his initial into the man's forehead as a symbol of ownership. He wears a collar designed to cause pain and prevent him from lying down or resting properly. Around him, we see other instruments used to punish and humiliate enslaved people. These objects were part of the daily reality for many slaves, who were forced to work in terrible conditions and endure inhumane punishments. The 4th United States Colored Infantry was one of the many units formed after the Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863. As the Civil War dragged on, Lincoln considered the emancipation of slaves essential to weakening the Confederate States. The proclamation freed all slaves in Confederate states and authorized freedmen to serve in the Union Army. Around 180,000 African American soldiers served in the Union Army, contributing to the victory over the Confederates. African American teenagers detained in the convict labor system in Florida. After the end of slavery, many African Americans were arrested for crimes like vagrancy, a vague term that allowed for the criminalization of almost any behavior. Once incarcerated, they were forced to work without pay for the state or leased to private companies. This system, known as convict leasing, emerged as yet another way to ensure a continuous supply of free labor and maintain control over the black population. This April 1939 photo, taken in Marshall, Texas, shows Win Willis, a former slave, holding the horn that was used to summon slaves for daily work. At the time of the photo, Willis claimed to be 116 years old, born on March 10, 1822. As taught to him by his former owner, Bob Wynn, when he was still young. Born in Louisiana, he lived to see the United States transition from slavery to freedom and shared stories about his past. A representation of the slave Anastasia wearing an iron mask, one of the many instruments of torture used during the slavery period in Brazil. These masks prevented the person from speaking, eating properly, or even breathing easily, and were mainly used to silence those who attempted to rebel or disobey their masters. Anastasia's story made her a symbol of the struggle for freedom, showing the inhumane conditions many enslaved people faced in Brazil. Enslaved Africans picking cotton under the supervision of an overseer. This scene was common on plantations in the southern United States, where enslaved labor was the foundation of the agricultural economy. Cotton, known as white gold, was one of the most lucrative products of the time, and enslaved people worked long hours under inhumane conditions to ensure abundant harvests. Overseers, often armed, kept the slaves working at a fast pace, using severe punishments for any signs of resistance or fatigue. In this 1897 photograph, we see coolies sorting tobacco leaves under the supervision of a Dutch overseer in a warehouse in Delhi, Indonesia. In the late 19th century, tobacco production in Sumatra was one of the main economic activities of the colony, supplying international markets. These workers, often from China and India, were hired under precarious conditions, facing long hours and low pay. The use of coolie labor was common in Dutch colonies and was fundamental to the growth of the tobacco industry at the time. Omar Ibn Said, an Islamic scholar who was captured and sold as a slave in the United States. Before his capture, Omar was a respected scholar in his homeland of Senegal, where he received formal education in Islamic theology and mathematics. He was captured during a local conflict and trafficked to America, where he was enslaved for more than 50 years. In this 1880 photograph, we see sugarcane cutters in Jamaica taking a break to eat sugarcane during their work on plantations. Sugarcane was one of the island's main industries, driving both local and international economies. The workers, many of whom were descendants of African slaves, played a crucial role in the cultivation and harvest of this raw material. Even after slavery was abolished in 1838, many former slaves and their descendants continued to work on the plantations under difficult conditions, as Jamaica's economy still heavily relied on sugar exports. Thomas Mundy Peterson was the first African American to vote in an election after the passage of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which guaranteed the right to vote to all male citizens, regardless of race. In March 1870, Peterson made history by exercising this right in a local election in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. His vote was an important milestone in the fight for racial equality, especially during the Reconstruction period when African Americans began to participate more actively in the political process. The slave market in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1864, was one of the many human trading centers that existed in the southern United States before the end of the Civil War. In these markets, African American men, women, and children were sold as commodities, often separated from their families. When the Union occupied Atlanta during the Civil War, many of these markets were destroyed, symbolizing the decline of slavery in the United States. In this autumn 1910 photo from Pitt County, North Carolina, we see a convict gang resting after working on road construction. The prisoners were transported in the wagons visible in the image, which had bars on the sides resembling cages to keep them confined during transport. These mobile wagons allowed labor to move from one location to another as needed, aiding in road construction. The interior of a slave pen in Alexandria, Virginia, around 1865. These locations served as holding centers where slaves, often separated from their families, awaited auction. Alexandria was one of the largest slave trading centers in the United States, responsible for sending around 1,000 slaves per year to the South. In this photo, we see American prisoners who were captured and forced to work as slaves during the war with Japan. These men, held in inhumane conditions, were forced to perform hard labor in prisoner camps, where they faced starvation, disease, and torture. Many of these prisoners worked on the infamous Death Railway, where approximately 12,000 prisoners lost their lives due to extreme conditions. The deck of the British ship HMS Daphne was filled with over 100 slaves who were rescued between November 1st and 4th, 1868. These men, women, and children had been captured by Arab slave traders and were freed during a Royal Navy operation in the Indian Ocean. After abolishing slavery in its territories in 1833, Britain took on an international role in fighting the slave trade, sending ships to patrol known trafficking routes. The first photo shows slaves rescued aboard the HMS Sphinx, still in poor condition after being taken from the hands of the traffickers. Below, we see the same individuals after being saved, now dressed in new clothes and regaining some dignity. After being rescued, many were sent to British colonies in East Africa, where they had the opportunity to start a new life. This photo, taken in 1862, shows slaves left behind by Confederate General Thomas F. Drayton, who fled as the Union Army advanced. After being abandoned, many of these enslaved people found an opportunity to seek their freedom. In situations like this, the Union Army often offered protection and shelter to the enslaved, allowing many to join Union troops as workers or even soldiers. Farmers wait for the opening of a slave market in St. Louis, Missouri in 1852. At these markets, enslaved men, women, and children were displayed like merchandise, often on platforms or stages, to be physically assessed before being sold to landowners and traders. St. Louis attracted many slave traders, especially due to its proximity to the Mississippi River, which facilitated the transportation of slaves to other regions. Harriet Tubman, seen on the left holding a pot alongside a group of people she helped escape from slavery in the late 19th century. Born enslaved in 1822, Harriet escaped slavery in 1849. After her escape, she returned to the South multiple times, guiding about 70 enslaved people to freedom through the Underground Railroad. In total, Tubman helped more than 800 people escape from slavery. She never lost a single passenger on her journeys, making her one of the most admired figures in American history. Frederick Douglass escaped slavery in Maryland and became a prominent figure as an abolitionist, orator, writer, and statesman. Douglass was the first African American to be appointed to a significant political office, serving as a United States diplomat to Haiti. His personal example directly refuted slaveholders' claims that enslaved people lacked the intellectual capacity to be independent citizens. Mrs. Sally, 88 years old, is a former slave observing the Emancipation Proclamation document in 1947. When the proclamation was issued, she was only 3 years old. Although she grew up in freedom, her life was marked by challenges. During a period when the civil rights struggle was beginning to gain momentum, her experiences reflected the difficulties many African Americans faced in trying to build a dignified life in a country still grappling with the legacies of slavery. Slaves working on a coffee plantation in the Paraíba Valley, Brazil, one of the country's main production regions during the 19th century. Coffee plantations played a central role in the Brazilian economy, with coffee becoming the primary export product. The slaves, who formed the backbone of the labor force, were responsible for planting, harvesting, and processing the beans. At the height of coffee production in the Paraíba Valley, it is estimated that more than 1 million slaves were used to meet the growing international demand. Former female slaves attending a convention in Washington in 1916. These meetings provided a space for former slaves to share their stories, celebrate their freedom, and discuss the issues that still affected their lives and future generations. Although slavery had been abolished more than 50 years earlier, many challenges, such as discrimination and inequality, still persisted. These gatherings represented the ongoing pursuit of justice and equality. Here we see the Shores family in Custer County, Nebraska, in 1887. Rachel and Jerry Shores, third and fourth from the left, were among the former slaves who settled in the region after abolition. These settlements marked the presence of African Americans in the Old West, where many former slaves sought land and freedom. Like other Western pioneers, these freedmen's families helped shape the American frontier, building farming communities and facing challenges such as harsh weather and isolation. Slaves and workers on a Cuban plantation during a midday break, 1863. Cuba, as one of the last Spanish colonies to abolish slavery, still relied heavily on slave labor in its sugar and tobacco plantations. The image captures a rare moment of rest for the workers who faced long hours under the tropical sun. Here we see Villa Americana, a colony founded by former Confederates who migrated to Sao Paulo, Brazil, after the Civil War. About 10,000 Confederates fled after their defeat, seeking a new home in Brazil, where slavery was still legal until 1888. They established farming communities like Villa Americana, bringing their cultural practices and the use of slave labor to these new lands. To this day, many descendants of these Confederates still reside in the region, and their traditions remain alive, blending Brazilian and southern United States influences. In this 1862 photograph, we see slaves on J.J. Smith's plantation in South Carolina. Cotton plantations like J.J. Smith's relied almost entirely on slave labor to sustain the southern United States economy. It is estimated that by the mid-19th century, the export of cotton produced by slaves accounted for more than 50% of American exports, showing how deeply the country's economy was connected to forced labor. A church service celebrating the signing of the Lei Áurea, the law that officially abolished slavery in Brazil, signed on May 13, 1888. On the left, we see Princess Isabel, heir to the Brazilian throne, who signed the law. The abolition was the result of years of pressure from abolitionist movements, and Princess Isabel's signing of the Lei Áurea was a decisive moment, making Brazil the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. The former beauty queen Miss Wyoming, Joyce McKinney, was arrested by police after kidnapping Mormon missionary Kirk Anderson in an incident that shocked the public. In 1977, McKinney took Anderson from his church in England and held him captive for 3 days, forcing him to be her slave. The case gained international attention for its unusual nature and the involvement of a former Miss USA, an African-American slave stirring something in a cast iron pot in the yard of a plantation, while a child watches. The slaves' diet generally consisted of simple and nutritious foods such as corn, beans, sweet potatoes, and yams. Despite the harsh living conditions, cooking was a way to keep African traditions and identity alive. The ruins of a slave cabin, seen here in 2012, remain on a former plantation along the banks of the Combahee River in rural Beaufort County, South Carolina. This site was the scene of one of Harriet Tubman's boldest raids, where, alongside black Union troops, she led the Combahee River Raid in 1863, freeing more than 750 enslaved people. Despite the end of slavery, families working the rice fields in the region continued to live in the cabin until the 1970s. During the Civil War, many black men who escaped slavery joined the Union Army, like the men pictured in this photo. Despite their bravery and dedication, these soldiers initially received lower pay than their white counterparts. Only after protests and public pressure did Congress pass equal pay in 1864, ensuring that black soldiers received the same salary as whites. A group of contraband slaves at the Allen's Farm near Yorkville, Virginia, during the Civil War. Known as contrabands, these slaves fled Confederate territories in search of refuge in Union-controlled areas. This began when commanders decided to treat runaway slaves as war contraband, refusing to return them to their former Confederate owners. Sharecroppers picking cotton in Georgia in 1898, a system that became common after the abolition of slavery. President Andrew Johnson supported this new practice, known as sharecropping, which replaced slavery as the primary form of agricultural labor in the South. Under this sharecropping system, black laborers worked land owned by white landowners in exchange for a portion of the crop, but they were often exploited with high costs for food and housing. Many sharecroppers continued to live in the same slave quarters as before, keeping them in extreme economic and social dependence, similar to slavery. 5 generations of an enslaved family on the Smith Plantation in Beaufort, South Carolina in 1862. Here we see grandparents, parents, children, and grandchildren all born and raised in captivity under the slave system. Even after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, many enslaved people would only experience true freedom years later, with the end of the Civil War.